Here's the deal that you need to understand with the book. Basically, I was working with when I first came out as a public informant, 2000, and by the way, if you ever hear various cultists of the Kings of Edom that are attacking my character, they say all kinds of bullshit about all kinds of crap. And what they really get mixed up is the chronology. And understand that I started appearing on Coast to Coast AM as caller back around the time my parents were still alive. So my father died 2007, my mother died 2011. So I was really starting to come out around 2007 and started appearing more and more on Coast to Coast AM as a caller, and got on Coast to Coast AM itself as a guest around 2011, 2012. So we're talking about that period of time when my mother died was the year of Fukushima Daiichi, same month, as a matter of fact, same week. So within that span of time, I was already a public informant. Now, by the time that my mother died and I became a public informant, fully outed as such, then of course Colonel Michael Aquino dispatched assets of his to try and maintain some kind of handle on me and tether me, keep me kind of under control. And so Lorian Ann Fenton was the first of those. And Lorian Ann Fenton wanted to take advantage of the fact that before I met her, before she was dispatched as an asset assigned to basically handle myself, maintain me under control, in the sense of preventing me from basically accessing the public to any great degree. And by the way, you might say, knowing this, why did you take her on as quote unquote a manageress? Understand, most of the people out there who don't deal with espionage, you don't realize that as a spy who comes in from the cold situation, you don't really have a choice. It's better that than having people constantly trying to kill you. It's better that than having to deal with so many other burdens. And at any rate, it's almost impossible to do anything alone. So you need to almost team up with even an assigned handler to get something out there, than doing it by yourself where you can't get anything out at all. So you may be turned into, at least for a time, controlled opposition, but otherwise you won't get anywhere. So I had to get on some platform. In my case, it was Revolution Radio. I wouldn't have gotten that without Lorian Ann Fenton. So there was all this that is the nuance of the situation. Now, when it comes to some of the nuance of that situation, when I was working by myself, my mother's still alive, still taking care of her in her final days. I was involved as a public informant with an idiot, I think his name was John Michael Greer, I think, who ran a show called shadowsinthedarkradio.com. He was loosely affiliated with Ripley's Believe It or Not, and he purchased Mysteries Magazine. Now, the woman who had Mysteries Magazine ran it for years successfully. He purchased it and ran it to the ground in 2 issues. Basically, 2 to 3 issues, it was dead meat in the water. Its main readers as a pulp rag magazine, in other words, paper magazine, actual product, were prisoners and the military, and which is both kind of like the same audience. So he refused to do what I suggested, which was, look, you own the magazine, you can produce a special issue anytime you want. And I produced a very long article for him at his insistence so he could publish it, and it never got published. So we decided to expand that into a book. But the article, he gave the stupid title because he wanted me to write about both vampires and zombies, neither of which are undead. That is an ancient superstition. Vampires are very much alive. Zombies are impacted in such a manner that you might think they're dead or reanimated, but they're technically alive. The undead is kind of a stupid term to apply to either case. And when I told him this, he said, well, it's a selling point because both of these had something to do with communism in terms of the exploitation of both of these conditions. So he called it the Red Undead. So this very long article I wrote called The Red Undead, at great exhaustion to myself, staying up several nights and losing sleep over days and days, he never used. So Lorian Ann Fenton said, let's hire a professional writer to turn it into a book. But of course, she didn't want to pay anybody. So somebody came forward and volunteered himself, named David John West. And David John West was a Mormon guy who ultimately used myself as a consultant in a short story that was the most popular short story in the anthology of short stories titled Space Eldritch, and Eldritch stories with a space theme. And so when I served as a consultant for that, the one thing I noticed was he didn't want to use one term that I said should be used. I said, if you're using this in your short story, he credits me in the anthology, by the way. I'm the last credit, which is the most important. People remember the first and the last. I'm the last guy he credits as a consultant, and everybody loves his short story. I always thought we should have written many more of them, but he and I never found the time to get together. And then somewhere along the line, he grew to hate me. But originally, we were very good friends, very intimate, shared quite a bit. And he never blamed me initially, at least consciously, for his wife's attempt to try and sleep with me. And he handled that very well and put his blame elsewhere. And ultimately, I guess all that soured. But the point was, for a period of time there, he volunteered to expand The Red Undead into a larger book format. But the problem was he was a fiction author, and he tried to make this into a novel type story. And as Sean Bond can tell you, he's got the book. This is a series of medical notes. You can't turn this into a goddamn novel. It's like taking Gray's Anatomy, the medical textbook, and trying to novelize it and add romance. It's just a stupid idea, and it doesn't work at all. He was trying to basically take the fact that I had encountered one of these artificially created female vampires, which the Soviet Union had created. It tried to create female vampires, and it did so by the most primitive method in the days before genetic engineering, through medical and surgical means, basically supermassive blood transfusions, killed most of the people that they worked with, and wound up finally succeeding with very few female vampires created artificially, and those that survived the process in mind and body. Because understand, this isn't something like you just are, it's not something even as simple as, say, for instance, look at this. You know, a woman becomes pregnant and her body is built in such a way that it can accommodate that. But she changes. Her very bones begin to warp. What's inside her takes so much energy, the woman literally changes shape. So say the woman gets an abortion, and what that does is it takes that bodily rebalance and takes away the cause of that bodily rebalance, and she's not pregnant anymore. That alone warps again the physical nature of everything she's contending with. And so just as the postpartum blues, delivering the baby, creates suddenly the loss of what she had bonded with, carrying this being under her heart for 9 months, and she's left with this sense of loss and depression. You get that instantly with the abortion, and you get everything changing. For men can never begin to even comprehend the horror of pregnancy, of eating for 2 people. It's a terror, like having a tapeworm that's devouring everything you're eating. The everything about that. If you were to suddenly become a vampire, and not even suddenly, these women who were made into such by the Soviet Union had to go through months and months and months of torture to transform. Think of something far beyond pregnancy. You're changing what you subsist off of. You're suddenly subsisting off of blood. Your entire body changes to accommodate that. You're no longer going to think the same way. All of the processes biochemically have changed. So you no longer think like a human being. You are now thinking like a non-human. You are thinking as someone who is beyond human. So basically, you are no longer part of the human link in the food chain. For all human beings, you all think that you're the apex predators because you have denuded the earth of entire species. But the reality is, you're not at the top at all. You're towards the middle. Human beings are at the same level, somewhere between an anchovy and a pig. You are something that eats far more vegetables than you eat meat. Now, granted, there's plenty of Americans who have done their best to warp that diet and eat as much meat as possible and almost never touch their vegetables. But the reality is, humanity as a whole is far more vegetarian than it is predatory in nature, subsisting off of meat. At the top of the food chain, apex predators are pure meat eaters. This is all they're going to eat, is other forms of life. So human beings are nowhere near that. In fact, if a human being were fed nothing but meat, they would die. They would die fairly quickly. It might take a few years, but you can't live like that. This is hence the balanced diet. So you are not like my mother. My mother was very close to an apex predator. My mother hunted people down and killed them and drained them of blood. She could do that. I am only a fourth vampire, not half. I cannot drain a person dry. My mother had the capacity physiologically to hold 12 liters of blood, that much blood from an adult male, in her belly, like she was suddenly pregnant, like a camel hump. She could carry that and sustain herself for weeks from an exsanguination, from draining someone dry. I do not have that capacity to imbibe that much blood. So when it comes to the human tropic level, your ability to subsist off of sustenance, if you were on a scale of 1 to 5, a primary producer would be a plant, and 5 would be the apex predator, a pure animal that eats so much off the food chain in terms of meat that it has few predators of its own. Between that, human beings are in there in the middle, 2.21 on average. Basically, roughly equal to an anchovy or a pig. So all of you think differently because of it. When you suddenly become an apex predator, say the Soviets did to you what they did to so many of these women that they tried to dispatch as agents for the Soviet state, you suddenly are thinking so radically differently that most of them went insane. They simply could not maintain the sense of balance between their new diet and anything that anchored them to humanity anymore. Since other human beings become food to you, then you can't relate to them. Do you understand what I'm saying? So, since you can't relate to them, since they're like cattle, then your ability to even talk to them diminishes. So, this is the issue to understand. People have romanticized vampires, and they think of them as some of the most elegant and erudite and well-read and sophisticated cosmopolitans around, urbane and seductive. And all of this is a product of the Dark Ages and the Black Plague. During the time of the Black Plague, vampirism became conflated with nobility because of the ignorance abounding at the time. And it was due to the fact that the nobility imbibed a lot of silver to ward off the Black Plague. Now, colloidal silver no longer does this. You can imbibe colloidal silver that's on the market, and unless you're imbibing toxic amounts of it, you should be fine if you're taking it at a controlled level responsibly. But it's an antibiotic. And in the old days, they used pure silver, silver coins, as an antibiotic. The metal would destroy many of the germs that were in the water. So what the nobility would do would be they would liquefy it through their alchemists into colloidal silver. And this was edible, potable. So when their alchemists did this during the Black Plague, the nobility would be drinking this on a daily basis and they would never get the plague. But at the same time, the effect would be to turn many of them blue. You can look up a case of a man who took too much colloidal silver and he turned blue. They called him Papa Smurf. There are also people, entire tribes, born with this condition, some morbidly inbred families in the Appalachian Mountains, for instance. And this is basically a kind of blood change, hence the term blue blood, affiliated with nobility. They called them blue bloods because many of them had turned literally blue. Now, to the peasantry, they looked dead. And the peasants began to wonder, why are so many millions of us dying? But the nobility has turned blue and they survive. They never die. And it was assumed the nobility was undead, that they were living off of the deaths of everyone else beneath them. And therefore, the peasantry began to affiliate the nobility with vampirism. This is how that concept developed of Count Dracula, of the Baron, oh God, who was the Strigoi type of vampire, the Nosferatu. All of this became conflated in the public mind with the nobility also being evil, to the point where people thought, oh, nobility is evil, nobility is parasitic, we must get together with our pitchforks and torches and burn the castle down. This is what led to peasants' rebellions that had to be put down by the dynasties. But this is where the concept comes from of nobility, blue blood, and vampirism all conflated in the public mind into this idea of the erudite, educated vampire. Now, the only reason the original Vladislav Sepish, Dracula, fit into that stereotype was at the time that he was originally a vampire hunter. His father was half vampire. He was a fourth vampire. He was like me. But he suffered on the field of battle a near-death experience. And in his case, his clinically dying, as I did, triggered that recessive gene. And that triggering of that recessive gene enabled him to become far more hematophagic than he was before, and he was able to take blood as a essence of sustenance, which before that period in life he had been unable to. Now, I have been clinically dead, so in that sense, I am arisen. In that sense, it was the same with Dracula, the original, who became Nosferatu Rex, the king of the undead. The reason why was because as someone who became vampiric, because of the recessive gene kicking in with the near-death experience, basically, he was undead. So again, conflation, confusion. Is a person who suffers a near-death experience undead? Of course not. They are as alive as you and I, and vampires are alive. They do what they can to mimic the dead, at times as a survival mechanism, like playing possum. And that was why they became conflated again with the undead. Also, they spread rabies, or have the potential to spread rabies. And as a result, you suddenly see many people who degenerated, and they thought of these people as being vampirized. This is what I go into in the book. And the problem was when we were dealing with David John West, he tried to take my encounters with the female vampire in the Balkans when I was serving as a mercenary there. He tried to take that and romanticize it and turn it into a love story on which the rest of the narrative would pivot. And I said, I don't want to talk about it. It's a very private memory. Other than sharing the fact that it happened, I was not going to go into depth with it. And he therefore had nothing to work with. And he was fired from the project. So when he was fired from the project 2 years later, we got it published, even to the point where it has an ISBN number. It's on Amazon. The Red Undead is on Amazon with an ISBN number, ISBN. You don't get that unless a book is published. It's like a social security number. You don't get one unless you survive the birth canal. Once you get out of the birthing process, and if you make it through that, you get a social security number. So it was published. He suddenly was recruited by one of my most active gang stalkers to claim it was never published. And that way, he telegraphed before he punched. He rattled before he struck. I knew, holy shit, he's going to take all my notes, he's going to publish them and claim they're his, because he was given the credit of being the co-author on the Red Undead, because we felt he had volunteered his time, he got fired, so we just left his name on as co-author, as kind of like, just as he had credited me for as a consult for his short story in the book, the anthology, Space Eldritch. So he was going to now run with it. So we had to get something out there immediately. And what we did was we cobbled all the notes we could together that we got out there immediately, but half the book is missing. So when you buy Vampirology, you get a lot of the physiology of the vampires, but none of the history, or not enough. All of that will be presented when we revise and expand the book, and we will do that, but enough of you have to buy this one. I swear to God, this was never intended as a marketing gimmick. Honest to God.
No,
It's just...
go for it.